рамках першої конференції нульової корупції залишається буквально
We
дві
have
панелі,
just two panel discussions remaining until the end of Zero Corruption Conference, but they at least the most long awaited. Now it is the time to pass to recommendations to the evaluation of results of this international forum. Next to me there is Hanna Hopko, who is the head of the conference Democracy in Action. So Hanna, how do you evaluate the results of work during these 2 days in the studio, beyond the studio? Well, actually, I would like to thank our charming moderator, Inna Borzela, because these 2 days holding all of us energetic, actually, thanks to your professionalism and all those complicated questions that you asked the participants. And I would like to tell you these are participants from over 40 countries, those who also physically arrived. That's over 80 different speakers in our conference, and I can only imagine how in these 2 days of such marathon, which lasted for a long time, you actually put through all the answers. Sometimes I saw you actually ask some sharp questions to the representative of German Foreign Ministry about Nord Stream 2, and that was actually the task of our conference, that open conversation. What hybrid threats to the democracy are and how to counter them. Because this is a serious issue, and we see that not only in Ukraine, but also the Western countries, they already suffer from disinformation, propaganda, strategic corruption, and legal wars. And here it is important to join efforts. What I would like to say is that 30 years have passed since the restoration of Ukrainian independence, and this is the first Zero Oligarchs Conference. I believe that this is also a great achievement of our civil society. These are powerful CSOs like Center for Counter-Corruption, the whole team which worked, New Europe Center, Globalistic Strategy 21st Century Center, also the Center of Environment, Law and Human, Opora, Center for Civic Freedoms. We have a long list of people who invested not only for several months. They actually showed that Ukraine is able to be its president. Are you happy with the messages that we received from both sides of the Atlantic, from our partners? Which is our mood for the agenda of other international forums which are soon going to happen? Well, here we have to say that next week we're going to have important meetings. There is NATO summit, there is G7 summit. We also know there's going to be a meeting of Biden and Putin, and there were questions to the President of Moldova, to Vice President of the European Commission, to NATO representatives. How do you combine and join efforts? And what's most important is that here Ukraine proposes a solution, because very often we are blamed that yes, there is corruption there, but it was important for us to remind everyone that corruption is also there in the West. Many officials do not shy away from dirty money. All these dances from the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, who now has obtained a post in the supervision board in Rosneft. This is an example how authoritarian regimes and Putin buys not just the loyalty, but actually infiltrates its representatives. And also our Czech representative was talking about the consequences of such erosion of values. And I think that democracy in action is not just about statements. It is about the readiness to protect human rights here and now. And when representatives from the Department of State, Magnitsky, Bill Browder, clearly talked about the importance to put more pressure on authoritarian regimes so that they had to pay high price, and so that they would be unwilling to perform reprisals over civil activists and journalists. I think that is also very important. You have correctly pointed out that we had partners from both sides of the Atlantic, and our panel on legislative changes, how do you strengthen this cooperation to limit the influence of dirty money on the approval of decisions in the civilized countries of Western democracy, pointedly showed that. I think that Ukraine, which has been countering Putin's aggression for the 8th year in a row, from cyber attacks, propaganda, fakes, to disruptive activities of the fifth column, we have shown that we can manage. Plus, the presidents of Moldova and Georgia as trendsetters of the region. And I would also like to thank New Europe Center for their study about the vision of 2030, NATO, and the achievements that are already there in Ukraine. I would like to thank Institute of mass media, Telekritika, Detector Media, for the studies they also performed about Russian propaganda. Because this is an example how Moscow tries, through propaganda, both in Ukraine and other countries of the Eastern Europe, to actually put the society against the West. In several hours, our conference is going to be over, and more field work will start. Work in various institutions, analytical work. What are the next steps of your team in search for answers for hybrid threats to the democracy? As my colleague and supporter says, Daria Kaleniuk, actually I'm very thankful to her for these 2 years of such close cooperation. First, I would really like to write letters of thanks, because this is huge. Thanks to the congressmen who participated online, to all our speakers, to Samantha Power. But we already have plans of following events, because I believe that our first forum on such international level, protection of democracy, or how do you restore the power of democracy, the attacking power, the preventative power, is also an important contribution to the idea of US President Biden of Global Democracy Forum. And here Ukraine has shown that we are not just in the forefront, we're actually at the forefront of decision-making, which we have already worked out in these 2 days. We have several more ideas about climate, protection of environment, education, because we saw it on the example of disinformation, what's happening to the critical thinking in people. So I believe that this is an annual conference. It's the first time that it happened so widely. We actually planned to have it in 2020, but we postponed it due to the pandemic. We believe that it is very important that this is the first conference, It actually turned out to be rather powerful from the point of decisions that we voiced. For the following conference, I hope we are going to have more energy and less organizational hassle, which was really going on 24/7. What kind of ambience was behind the curtains? We have just 1 minute left, because apart from side events, apart the main track, the newsroom solution studio, we had lots of interesting meetings in the couloirs. Well, not just in the couloirs, we had additional side events, as you said, which were going in parallel to the key conferences. It was a close conversation in Belarus how to help them so that they could have democracy's victory there. Disinformation, how do you coordinate the work of various agencies? Reforming the defense sector, which Transparency International was doing. But actually, I'm immensely thankful to all people who worked and who are now probably dreaming of having a rest, but who are preparing these media reports. And a great thanks to God for the strength and for the fact that this conference showed its capacity, showed the capacity of Ukraine to set trends, to form the agenda, to openly talk about the problems that we have and the West has, and what's most important, to look for solutions. And I thank you for being daring enough to initiate and to hold this high-profile event. And I thank our participants of the conference who have waited until the panel dedicated to oligarchs and fighting oligarchs, because a unique feature of this event is the absence of any oligarch funds and oligarch resources for this conversation. This is oligarch-free. And the moderator of this panel on de-oligarchization, this is Bonner, who is the executive director and editor-in-chief of Kyivpost, our media partner.
Good afternoon, good morning in America. Bronner, Chief Editor of the Kyivpost. We are a media partner for this conference, proud media partner. The Kyivpost is, and I want to thank Hanna Hopko. I'm glad that her dream has come true with this conference. It's a marathon conference. But the Kyivpost, I'll do a little promotion first. We are Ukraine's English language paper since 1995, so we've covered the oligarchs since the beginning. And in a stroke of great timing, we have 4 new videos on our website about oligarchs. We have all of our oligarch coverage under a thing called Oligarch Watch. So I will start. We have a terrific panel of experts here. So I'm going to talk as little as possible and get them on stage. But let's first set the stage. Who are the oligarchs and why are they so dangerous? Out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, a small group of mostly men acquired the greatest assets. Some said stole, but others say it was all perfectly legal. In any case, they got great deals. They acquired massive amounts of wealth that transferred non-transparently, non-competitively, and to keep this wealth, they built influence. They built media empires around it. They influenced state government. They infiltrated state institutions. They built this entire apparatus to keep their powers, to keep their privileges. Periodically, there have been attempts to take back what was privatized and sell it competitively for the benefit of the Ukrainian people. All those efforts have gone nowhere. But we, in Ukraine, the consequence, why is this so important? The consequence of living in an oligarchy or living among oligarchs is very obvious. Economic competition is stifled, foreign investment is weak, billions of dollars that could have been paid to the taxes to improve schools, pensions, et cetera, instead goes offshore, and rule of law is completely flouted. There's been no convictions of anybody for any serious financial crimes or even murders in Ukraine's almost 30 years as an independent nation. But there is stirrings here, and the activity is happening in America. Joe Biden has recently come out and declared fighting international corruption is a matter of U.S. national security, and he's laid out a fairly detailed blueprint. And in Ukraine, President Zelensky has declared war on the oligarchs and has actually named the 13 oligarchs, defined oligarchs, and submitted a law to limit their influence. So we'll see if anything comes of this flurry of activity. And we have our experts here to help us make sense of it all. I want to start, first of all, I want to introduce our experts, and then we're going to start with Кейсі Мішель. Кейsі Mішель is an investigative journalist, author of the forthcoming book, American Kleptocracy. I guess you can't buy it now yet. I'm anxiously looking forward to reading it and to seeing if he's going to go down the line in nations and write about their kleptocratic developments. We also have Karen Greenaway, who I've heard speak before. She's a longtime FBI supervisory agent, now an independent expert, very good on the topic. She knows how to investigate cases and can tell us maybe, hopefully, what are the best strategies. We also have Matthew Murray of Columbia University Harriman Institute with us, and the only Ukrainian, as it turns out, on the panel beside me, the famous Daria Kaleniuk, Executive Director of the Anticorruption Action Center. So I want to start with Кейсі Mішель. Кейsі, you are there.
Right here.
When can we buy your book, by the way?
Thanks, Brian. The book will be coming out November 16th, but please feel free to pre-order my book online from your favorite bookseller. As I've told everyone, I'm happy to buy anybody who pre-orders the book a round of drinks as a thank you. So you can go online and do that anytime. And Brian, I'm happy to begin the talk right now if you'd like to go ahead.
Let's do it. I know you have some visuals, and I think we need to cue them now or whenever you want. Go ahead.
Yeah,
the floor is yours.
That would be great. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks to everyone, obviously, Yaku, to Daria, to Hanna, to the entire team. This is a wonderful conference, a wonderful presentation. As Brian mentioned, I am an American journalist that writes on illicit finance, transnational money laundering, among a range of regimes, a range of organizations, and a range of individuals, including most especially the oligarchs we will be discussing today. Obviously, if people think of kleptocracy or what we now consider kleptocracy, you think of regimes in Moscow or Baku or maybe Kazakhstan as well. But clearly, there are figures and there are elements in Ukraine that are worth paying attention to, and those are, of course, the oligarchs. The first visual here details the rise of the oligarchs in Ukraine and in Russia over the last 30 years. And before I continue, I do have a few slides we will be discussing today. The slides do have a fair amount of information on them that I will be going through, but if anybody wants copies of these slides, of these visuals, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to share them as well and to go into further detail as well. But this first slide that you can see details the rise of the oligarchs. Now, as Brian just said, we can really point to the late 1980s, early 1990s, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the rise of what we came to describe as democratization in the 1990s. While that was happening in the political space, in the economic space, we also had the privatization of significant state assets through things like loans for shares programs and voucher programs. And as you'll see on the slide there, that brought together two entities, two movements, and two broad spheres. That is the businessmen on one side and organized crime on the other side. So while you had the democratization, the liberalization of the politics in places like Ukraine, you also had the increasing gaining of significant state assets from a small number of businessmen who were increasingly working very, very closely with organized crime. And that gave rise by the late 1990s into what we would describe as this caste of oligarchs. These figures, some of whom we'll describe in detail in a few minutes, that then began affecting policy in Ukraine, in Russia as well. I do want to highlight one moment. As you can see here, there are oligarchs all across the post-Soviet space in Russia, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Kazakhstan as well, and also here in Ukraine as well as in Moldova. These are a few of the key figures I wanted to highlight. You have a couple of Russian oligarchs. You have Abramovich, who's now in London. You have Friedman, who spends a lot of time in London as well. You have Ivanishvili, who is helping steer a lot of Georgian politics. Obviously, the oligarchs in these countries still very important, very, very influential. And then in Ukraine, you have three names you might be familiar with. We have Mr. Firtash, who is in Vienna right now. We have Mr. Kolomoisky, who some of you may be familiar with. We'll talk about him in a moment. And then you also have Viktor Medvedchuk, who I'm sure I don't need to explain, was recently sanctioned by the Ukrainian government. He may still be in Ukraine. He may not. If anybody knows where Mr. Medvedchuk is, please let me know. I'm happy to take a look. We can go to the next slide, though, as well. The next slide, when it comes up, details how these oligarchs access Western financial systems. So they've made their money, they control their assets, but they don't want to keep their money in Ukraine or in Russia or in Kazakhstan or in Azerbaijan. They want to get it out of the country and keep it safe. And this is how they do that. You have oligarchs at the top. Below them are what we have called as enablers. These are the Western professionals, the Americans, the Canadians, the Brits, the French, the Swiss, the Germans, et cetera, that help the oligarchs move their money, hide their money, and then spend their money wherever they want, however they want. And there's a whole range of figures and professions that do this. You have accountants, you have consultants and lawyers, and these consultants and lawyers also help transform the reputations of these oligarchs. They're no longer oligarchs. Now they're successful businessmen. Now they're moguls. They're no longer corrupt figures. You have shell company providers, trust providers, real estate agents, especially banks and financial institutions, all helping the oligarchs move their money. And there's one key tool that they use to hide that money in the West, and that is anonymity. They make sure the money is no longer connected to the oligarch. It's no longer dirty money. Now it's anonymous money, but it is still connected and controlled by the oligarchs. And they do this across another range of industries, all perfectly legally. This is all perfectly legal in the West, in the US, in Britain, in France, et cetera, et cetera. This is private equity, hedge funds, real estate, art, auctions, luxury goods. All of it. You can buy anything you want. You can invest as much as you want, perfectly legally and perfectly anonymously. And I do want to highlight one key role. You'll see lawyers right in the middle. The lawyers are connected to the anonymity. They're connected to the shell companies. They're connected to reputation laundering. If there is one key profession that plays a key role in laundering this money, moving this money, and transforming these figures into philanthropists and businessmen and moguls, it is the lawyers that play that key role for the oligarchs. So we can go to the next slide because I only have a few minutes left. I have two examples that I wanted to talk about that my book goes into much further detail about, but I wanted to just highlight two figures, two key Ukrainian oligarchs that, again, I'm sure everyone is wonderfully familiar with. The first is Mr. Igor Kolomoisky, who is still not sanctioned by the Ukrainian government, but he is sanctioned by the American government. He was sanctioned by the U.S. a few months ago for his massive corruption while running Privat Bank. So the details of Kolomoisky at Privat Bank, he allegedly stole $5.5 billion, but he could not keep that money in Ukraine. So where did he move his money to? Much of it went into the U.S., and much of it he did perfectly legally. Now, we know much of this because of the wonderful investigations in Ukraine as well as in the U.S. And I just want to highlight one of the parts of this network. You can see on the map, Privat Bank, he had to take the money out of Privat Bank, move it into Cyprus, into Privat Bank Cyprus, which then moved to the shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, which are, again, part of Britain. From there, he moved it to accounts in Deutsche Bank, which is a German bank, which is just a horribly corrupt bank that works with anybody and everybody, who, regimes, oligarchs, dictators, everybody around the world. Deutsche Bank is just a truly corrupt bank. But from there, they went to shell companies in the U.S. in the state of Delaware. Delaware is right in the middle of the map, you can see. And from there, the money is anonymous. The money went to a number of other American states, investments in buildings and steel plants. These American states had no idea the money was connected to Kolomoisky. They did not know it was connected to a Ukrainian oligarch. But Kolomoisky still controlled the money, still controlled those investments, and he hid hundreds of millions of dollars across the U.S. And you'll see in the state of Florida, he also worked with a number of Americans who are now facing charges in the U.S. because of their work with Kolomoisky. This is one of the many, many, many instances and maps of how oligarchs in Ukraine and Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan move their money, hide their money, and launder their money across the West, including in the U.S. And this is my final slide. This is about another Ukrainian oligarch, Mr. Dmitry Firtash, who is currently in Vienna. He is wanted by American authorities for large-scale bribery, and he is supposed to be extradited, flown to the U.S. to face charges hopefully soon. But 2 years ago, Mr. Firtash had an idea. He moved his money, he laundered his money, but now how is he going to spend his money? And one of the ways that he spent his money was on American lawyers. And he identified two key American lawyers that could help him access the highest levels of American political power, how to access the White House under President Donald Trump. And you'll see on this slide right here, he used two lawyers, Victoria Tinzing and Joe DiGenova, both of whom are very, very close to a figure named Rudy Giuliani, who you may be familiar with. Rudy Giuliani was and still is Trump's personal lawyer. Firtash used them to access Giuliani. He used them to access Bill Barr, who was the attorney general under Trump, to say that if Mr. Trump, if President Trump lifted the investigations into Mr. Firtash, that Mr. Firtash had dirt, he had information on Joe Biden. So he wanted to make a trade, give information about Joe Biden and remove the charges that the Americans have placed on Mr. Firtash. Now, Firtash had a couple other areas that he did as well. He had other figures to access President Trump, and he also had access to pro-Trump media to push this messaging, to push this rhetoric, and to push this idea that he had damaging information on Joe Biden that Donald Trump could use. Now, obviously, that didn't work. President Trump was impeached because of this network, and these efforts fell apart. And obviously, President Trump is no longer in power, but instead, Joe Biden is, which is not good news for these oligarchs at all. But this slide in particular shows now the oligarchs are no longer accessing just financial systems in the West. They are increasingly accessing the political systems in places like the US as well, which makes it that much more important that the US, the Ukrainian authorities, other partners, other investigators, and other governments around the world increase their focus on and efforts to target these oligarchs to make sure they don't have access to these financial systems and certainly don't have access to the political systems either. So I'll turn it back to you, Brian.
There was a lot. I think now is a good time to go to Karen. And by the way, Matt and Daria, jump in because I know we're distant, but we can still pretend like we're at the same table and have a conversation. Karen, it's only one. I mean, there's actually a lot of problems I see here. One is Kolomoisky's not charged with any crime or convicted of any crime. So it's hard to take any of this seriously, and I don't know how law enforcement can stop the flow when he's not convicted of anything. I mean, secondly, I mean, you know better than anybody that, I mean, there's been no convictions of anybody for financial crimes or even top murders in Ukraine. So it looks like we're in a situation where it's very hard to take Zelensky's fight against oligarchs seriously when there's nobody charged with bank fraud and $20 billion bank fraud. And at the same time, you know, Кейсі mentioned Delaware. It's also very hard to take U.S. efforts, current efforts to fight international corruption seriously when we still have all these laws, anonymity, dirty money flows, non-transparency. So maybe I'm missing something. Is there really something happening here, some sort of coordination that is going to lead to a cleanup?
So thank you, and thank you to the organizers for including me on this panel. So let me just kind of set the stage for you a bit. And thank you, Кейсі. That was a really excellent overview of how we got to where we are with these what we called, because I was in Russia in the early 1990s, businessmen who have now become, as we label them, oligarchs. From almost the outset, you know, those governments that saw the rise of these individuals as a challenge in the West because of their you know, quick access into, or I should say, quick insertion into the U.S., particularly the U.S. financial system. You know, we relied on law enforcement, and I was one of the people who was relied on to referee what was becoming this collusive control over the economies in the former Soviet Union and the states, former Eastern Bloc, to the exclusion of legitimate investors. So from my own experience, I can tell you, before I joined the Bureau, trying to work with businessmen out of Florida who wanted to invest in Russia and Ukraine, but they were locked out of those markets because these businessmen walked forward and used the control that they had through organized crime, as well as their connections to the legitimate, you know, arms of government, to scoop up these what could have been far more productive enterprises all across the spectrum, and as a result, you know, we expected that law enforcement, people like myself, would be able to simply, you know, look at these guys, you know, conduct a criminal investigation the way that we did against organized crime in the United States, and the way the Italians did in Italy, and then very successfully clean this all up, and it wasn't going to be a problem. But what we didn't do is we didn't give law enforcement the resources, we didn't give them the laws, and we did not give them the political support that they needed to do that job. And I can tell you that by the time we got to the early 2000s, already there was almost no appetite in my own country and in the EU to address this problem as a law enforcement matter, or to, frankly, address this problem at all. And so as a result, what we ended up with was trying to work through, individual law enforcement officers, in different agencies who were willing to put the resources, to doing that type of work, to try to address this massive, what was really a crime problem. And the way that we did it was we labeled it as, going after the upstream, we being the downstream, but going after the upstream problem. But of course, law enforcement in those countries, for the officers who were good, many of them who wanted to make a difference, who wanted to prevent the wholesale looting of the resources in their country, were often either removed from their positions. That was the best case scenario. Some of them, were fired, and some of them were actually murdered in an attempt to try to do the cases and bring the prosecutions that would, at the very least, slow down this ever increasing land grab for anything of value that really belonged to the citizens of these countries and should not have been at the exclusive control of a few individuals. So, so what happened is that, by the time that we came around to the last 5 years or so, there was very little respect within, frankly, the US government, the EU governments, for law enforcement initiatives to go after these individuals. And in fact, as you saw in the last 4 years in particular, law enforcement agencies like the one that I work for which was only in the last 4 years, whereas agencies like, NABU and some of the other law enforcement agencies that were trying to tackle corruption in these countries had been facing this same kind of, attack before it was really came down on the FBI in particular. Were disenfranchised and pushed to the side or pushed out of doing the work in some of the same ways that our colleagues back in the 90s and early 2000s were pushed out of the law enforcement agencies that were in these countries that were trying to do these cases. So as a result, what we ended up doing is doing the cases that we could make, which were those cases that were, there was very, there was good jurisdiction in the United States. Or I also want to point out, the work that the Spanish did in their cases. Jose Grinda Gonzalez was and is a fabulous prosecutor in Spain who really took on a lot of these individuals using some excellent, Spanish legislation that's out there. But we were individuals. We were a squad, of agents, 14 agents, or 2 case agents relying on, the system as it exists to exchange evidence with countries that really were not interested in doing any kind of cases against these individuals, because so many people benefited, at least in the short term, from the money that was flowing out of them. And they really just didn't care that long-term impact that they were going to have on all of our economies. So the good news is that, we have that backing now with the President of the United States. We are seeing huge changes in the EU in recognizing, how detrimental it has been to our political systems to allow these individuals to migrate out of their, collusive control over the economies of places like Ukraine into essentially political actors, sometimes through, getting elected in the countries that they're in, and some other times by manipulating legislators in the countries that they're in, to, as Кейсі very adequately pointed out, to, being players in our own political system and political systems in Europe, which affect the policies that get implemented to try to break apart individuals and this, individuals from this exclusive and collusive control over these economies.
Okay. Karen, it sounds like the bad guys are several steps ahead of law enforcement. What would be just quickly, what would be the right strategy then? I mean, it seems like, Kolomoisky is facing lawsuits over bank fraud. Does it puzzle you why he's not facing criminal charges in Ukraine? Or do you know the answer to that already?
Oh, I know the answer to that already. And the answer to that already is because Kolomoisky and individuals like him have had the ability for the last 20 years to, directly influence how Ukrainian law enforcement does their job through collusive and corrupt activity. And so, earlier today, Artem Sitnik, the head of NABU, was on a panel, and it was correctly pointed out that he spends as much time fighting off these, daily attacks on his legal and political attacks in his organization that they do spend on doing their job as investigators and trying to bring some justice. That being said, they're phenomenally successful for what they are doing, but before that, we had a prosecutor general's office that, consistently went through ups and downs in terms of opening and closing cases against individuals, like Kolomoisky. There was never a level legal playing field where there was an understanding that, that office in particular, was going to be left outside of the political system in order to do their job independently. They never had the ability to work independently. And so, so as a result, if I'm a case agent in the US and I need to collect evidence in Ukraine, I don't have a partner in Ukraine that I can work with to collect that evidence. And so the case isn't going to get done. And I had many cases, as did colleagues of mine who did this work over more than 20 years, where we could not take the case anywhere because we couldn't rely on our partners in those countries to collect the evidence for us, not because some of them didn't have the will to do it or the capacity to do it, but because they didn't have the legal and political support in order to do their jobs independently and do them the right way.
Thanks. So the state is weak compared to the opponents that it's up against. I know solutions are supposed to talk, and maybe I want to hear Matthew's voice. Matthew, if law enforcement can't catch them, is there, and nobody's actually committed a crime in the sense that they've not been convicted of it, is there a way to, the assets aren't going to be coming back, so they're going to have them. Is there a way to sort of civilize or make oligarchs competitive, get them to obey the rule of law? What would be the solution if they're so much more powerful than the state?
Thank you, Brian. That's a great question, and I do want to address it right at the top here, because the solution set will include both better law enforcement and better rewards for legal behavior. We cannot address this at systemically embedded risk of oligarchy in Ukraine or in other countries without coming at it as both a law enforcement issue, but also as an economic growth issue. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But let me first congratulate Daria and thank Antec for this terrific 2 days of work. And indeed, I think you've captured the moment politically very well. And yesterday the conference opened with President Zelensky acknowledging that oligarchy is a national security threat. Administrator Samantha Power of USAID then went on to describe how, from the US perspective, Russian oligarchs aiding Ukraine oligarchs are attacking democracy and the rule of law in Ukraine and other countries. And she carried the welcome message from President Biden that he is the first US president indeed to elevate fighting corruption and fighting oligarchy as a core national security interest of the United States. And so the question becomes, how do we use this emerging political consensus and political will to engage in what may be transformational change around this issue? And, you know, I think that's going to require two things. It's going to require better root cause analysis and understanding of how oligarchy has become embedded in this case, the system of Ukraine, and then better diagnostics around what the solutions should entail. And so I'm going to spend just a couple moments on each of those issues. And I'm going to pick up first where Karen very aptly described what happened in the 1990s in Russia, and in Ukraine to some extent. The roots of oligarchy lie with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the transition from communism to capitalism. And at the time, as a community in the West, we perhaps did not recognize that capitalism is not some monolithic entity. There are different types of capitalism. There's big firm capitalism, there's state capitalism, there's entrepreneurial capitalism, and then there's something that is called oligarchic capitalism. And oligarchic capitalism began to take roots in both Russia and Ukraine in the early 90s, not only because of the legacy of central planning and state control of the economy from the Soviet Union, but because of czarist traditions in the region. And as you all know, under the czars, private property was not legalized. Boyars and the czars and their boyars basically extracted rents from the serfs and from the peasants in the region, and they developed what are known as extractive institutions rather than inclusive institutions. And so those very deeply rooted historical tendencies in Russia and Ukraine shaped an environment in which an oligarchic economy was able to take root in these countries. And oligarchy, though it has nominally features of capitalism and private property on paper, generally speaking, is based on the idea that governments design policies to protect the interests of a narrow few, to actually encourage informal economic activity, and create high barriers of entry to genuinely entrepreneurial, honest, and competitive companies. And so as this took root in the former Soviet Union and in Russia and Ukraine in particular, it became very hard indeed to isolate this phenomenon and use the rule of law, such as it was in this region, to enforce private property rules. And instead, what happened was that private property became a relative rather than an absolute concept. And so on top of that, of course, we have Putinism. And Putinism has created a geopolitical imperative around this because in Putin's oligarchy, the top leaders of the country have taken control of the key economic sectors, the key law enforcement agencies, and they need to survive. They need to expand in order to survive. You cannot confine Putin's oligarchy within the borders of Russia. So starting in the early 2000s, they began to export their methods, their corrupt methods, very successful at home, to try to take over energy sector and other major sectors in Ukraine and the region. And this became driven to such an extent that, in effect, they've tried to, by this time, create an alternative to the Western-based liberal economic rules-based order. And they're trying now to export oligarchy as an alternative form of governance throughout the region. So between what you might call the czarist roots of oligarchy and the geopolitical drivers of oligarchy, we now face what political scientists call the iron law of oligarchy. And the iron law of oligarchy simply stands for the proposition that dominant political and economic groups will always find pathways around good reforms, even the most well-intentioned reforms, and will attempt to deform the economies of their resident countries and perpetuate their power. And so now the good news is that in Ukraine, in particular, while this oligarchic economy took root, there's also very many green sprouts everywhere you look of an entrepreneurial economy. And the features of an entrepreneurial economy are quite distinct from those of an oligarchic economy. First, entrepreneurs have a stake in economic growth. Oligarchs have a stake in economic control. Entrepreneurs introduce a dynamic kind of equilibrium where when their private property is protected and their conduct is rewarded, they can grow entirely new companies, they can create new wealth, and they can breed new workforce. And so everywhere you look in Ukraine, I was there just a week ago, you can see signs of entrepreneurial growth. And so now the question becomes, as President Zelensky, with US support, begins to look at a systemic solution to this question, yes, of course, he needs to regulate the oligarchy more strictly. Of course, he should take antitrust actions against them. And of course, the laws should be better enforced. But at the same time, it's absolutely essential to grow the entrepreneurial economy by rewarding good behavior and also trying to isolate the bad social behaviors that come with oligarchy, including criminal behavior and attempts to treat economic activity as a game in which everybody's just trying to divide up the government pie. The real opportunity for President Zelensky in the future of Ukraine is to stop the interference of government in the economy and allow entrepreneurs to grow their assets, be able to gain new sources of financing, be able to trade their assets on public markets, and be able to, in the process, create a much more inclusive type of capitalism based on more democratic institutions. So if we look at the root causes and we look at pathways for solutions, I think the news is on balance good for Ukraine because of the strength of the entrepreneurial spirit in the country. And of course, this is what the Maidan was about. The Maidan was at one level a revolution that was intended to protect the dignity of small business and entrepreneurs. It was the first revolution in history over free trade principles. And so, the roots of the Maidan have spread, and they need to be nurtured and cultivated by the current government and business community.
Matthew, thanks for giving us some hope. We're down to 15 minutes. I have to get Daria here. We've talked about Zelensky's de-oligarchization proposed law. Can you walk us through that? And, I know you have a visual here. And also, you and I have been on this issue for many years. Should we be hopeful, or is this just more PR?
Matthew's talking about entrepreneurs and that entrepreneurs can save Ukraine, but all of these oligarchs, they claim that they are entrepreneurs. And it's a big issue how to distinguish oligarchs from actually entrepreneurs who are paying taxes and who are not interfering into politics and who are not interfering into the media space. That's a big issue, and I think the good thing about the presidential draft law, which I suggest we put in the visual here, is that there is a first attempt actually to say who is an oligarch. And according to the draft law initiated by President Zelensky, there has to be at least 3 out of 4.
Daria's visual here. Sorry, Daria.
Yeah, Daria's visual, please put in the screen.
There we go.
It's complicated, but actually, it's not that much complicated. Basically, an oligarch, according to a draft law from President Zelensky, as somebody who interferes into political life, takes part into political life, particularly finances political parties or politicians, someone who controls media, and someone who has a monopoly, either directly or through companies which he or she controls, merely he. And the fourth thing is that an oligarch is somebody who has wealth more than $87 million. So 3 of 4 of these things make a person oligarch. And then Zelensky suggests that National Security and Defense Council has to gather together and decide who from all these entrepreneurs who are saying they're entrepreneurs have to be into the register of oligarchs. So Volodymyr Zelensky suggests to have the register of oligarchs, which I don't really think will help to de-oligarchize Ukraine. And he also suggests that those who are in the register have to declare their assets as public officials do, and they are prohibited, they will be prohibited to finance political parties. And those top officials in Ukraine, in judicial system, in law enforcement system, among politicians, they will have to submit to this register every single communication with such oligarchs. So good intentions, good we have the discussion about oligarchs, good that President Zelensky says that oligarchs are the national threat, but I think that something we are missing here. And there are some serious risks because the National Security Council has a huge discretion. They can gather together and decide who out of all these oligarchs who are saying they are entrepreneurs are actually oligarchs and who are not. So, for example, Rinat Akhmetov, whom I consider an oligarch, is going public and saying, I'm an investor. But will Rinat Akhmetov appear into the register? I think President Zelensky will likely want to put first Poroshenko into this list of oligarchs. I believe he probably have to be in the list if all oligarchs have to be in the list. But it will be up to President Zelensky to decide who will be first and who will be never in this in this list. I think Viktor Pinchuk doesn't want to be there as well. I think Igor Kolomoisky, well, Igor Kolomoisky is probably the one who doesn't care. He's already mentioned by Antony Blinken that he is an oligarch. He's been sanctioned by the US. He's been investigated by the US and Ukraine. So he is the one who probably is happy. Well, I'm an oligarch, and now you guys are also oligarchs officially. So that's an issue here. And I'm a bit concerned with this initiative, which doesn't include the work of Anti-Monopoly Committee, who has actually to make real competition for entrepreneurs. For those who are willing to do business fair and compete with each other, Anti-Monopoly Committee has to work. But we don't see fines against Rinat Akhmetov, for example. We see that the monopoly is in media business. We talked today a lot about disinformation. But if we look who owns Ukrainian media, these are all oligarchs. And they are monopolies over media as well. So to clean up the media sector from oligarchs is also through the work of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. Nothing on that in the presidential draft law and nothing on that from President Zelensky. So I would want our president actually to focus on institutions when he is trying to deliver results. And judicial reform. We talked so much today about the judicial reform. Gianni Buchicchio, the president of the Venice Commission, came here, spent 2 days, met all leadership of the country and told, well, we worked for you. We made a list of recommendations how to do your judicial reform right, how to make sure that businesses here in Ukraine trust to judges and they can protect their investments, they can protect their businesses. Just do the reforms. Just don't do the way how you are trying to do that in the parliament. Simply make sure that foreign experts, international experts who are non-biased have crucial role in selecting of self-governance bodies in the judicial branch of power. So basically, I think this is what is missing, and I hope that this conference, this panel will help to deliver a message also to President Zelensky that this sounds nice, the register of oligarchs, but the way how you do that right is actually building institutions. And the last point I want to make here, as I'm the only one Ukrainian, and I'm happy to have all other Americans here sitting discussing about the oligarchs, the problem with oligarchs is not only in Ukraine. And let's be honest and fair about Ukraine. We have criticism about Ukraine from Western partners, and we as civil society, we are sometimes very happy for this very practical criticism. You have to fight oligarchs, you have to build rule of law, you have to build strong institutions. But listen, oligarchs penetrate Western financial system, Western legal system, use Western lawyers, Western PR firms in order to attack us, to attack good institutions. And if you look in the National Anticorruption Bureau, to whom Karen referred, it was attacked by Firtash lawyers, Joe DiGenova and Victoria Tutsing. And also FBI was attacked by these lawyers, American lawyers, hired by Dmitro Firtash, who is sitting in Austria. So the question is now to Austria, is the EU member state. But how come the EU member state cannot simply execute the international agreement to extradite Dmitro Firtash for already 7 years? You know, that's a big question. And we can say a lot about each EU member state. We can say a lot about Great Britain. We can say a lot about the US, how these jurisdictions are used by our oligarchs in order to whitewash their reputation, in order to whitewash in order actually to have a good lifestyle there and penetrate their political systems. So in the fight with oligarchs in Ukraine, the West has to clean it up as well. And this is the frank conversations, this is the sincere conversation. And I'm happy that President Joe Biden is saying right things. Let's start doing.
Right things, but he represented Delaware. So, you're right. I mean, the Dmitro Firtash, the Austrian Supreme Court ordered him extradited, and he still found a way to start the case over again and stay in Austria. Well, we're down to the lightning round here, so we already have solutions. Demonopolization, Karen, international cooperation and strengthening law enforcement. You know, Matthew talking about policies, government policies that encourage economic growth, competition, that sort of dilute the power. But I want everybody to have their final word. You don't have to answer this question, but I mean, based on what Daria said, do these labels really help, or is this just more cosmetic? Does this sound like a cosmetic fight? And then, but the floor is yours for the final word. And since we haven't heard from Кейсі in a while, let's start with Кейсі.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian. I mean, I know we only have a few minutes. I just want to echo everything Daria just said about the West cleaning up its own backyard, its own shop. I mean, Daria is exactly right. American officials, European officials, they can come to Ukraine as much as they want. They can recommend policy solutions. They can recommend personnel changes. But unless the anonymity is ended in real estate, unless the anonymity is ended in trusts, unless the anonymity is ended in shell companies, these oligarchs do not operate only domestically. They don't operate only in Ukraine. They are international figures. They are transnational figures. As we've seen with Firtash, as we've seen with Kolomoisky, as we've seen with Akhmetov, as we've seen with Pinchuk, they access Western financial systems. They access Western political systems to their advantage, and they do it perfectly legally. Now, I do want to say on a final optimistic note, it has been an incredible 2 weeks in the U.S. to watch the Biden administration finally come out and specifically address kleptocracy and corruption as a national security threat. And I don't think it's any coincidence that that timing lines up with what we've seen from President Zelensky and the Zelensky administration itself. There is finally momentum. There is finally room for optimism. And I can't wait to see where things go from here. So thank you, Daria. Thank you, Brian. I'll end there.
Karen, do you share the optimism?
I do share the optimism because, as I said earlier today when I was speaking with some of the other presenters, by making corruption a national security threat to the US, we are elevating it to the level of terrorism. And when we did that with terrorism in the early 2000s, the US massed significant law enforcement, intelligence agency, Department of Defense resources towards tackling that problem. And so I look forward to seeing the US do the same with this, with the problem of corruption, so that we can do, as Daria has rightly pointed out, clean up our own house. Because without us, these oligarchs would not exist. Let's be honest. Without our financial system, without our lawyers, without our, our ability to manipulate, the news through media control, and the airwaves and the insidious ways that these individuals and the governments that are behind them in some of the cases, when I'm particularly talking about Russia, for example, have been able to, dumb down the US standards and the EU standards for everything from journalism, to our financial standards. And we need to start treating these individuals as exactly what they are, that they are not here to play in the capitalist system the way that true capitalists are. They are there to play in the capitalist system to line their pocket. And they intend to and continue to use countries like Ukraine, countries like Moldova to exactly do that. They are not there to be the, true economic players that, we've pushed our own corporations and our own investors in that direction through in part through exactly what Daria said, which is the antitrust laws that we've enforced, the environmental laws that we passed and enforced, and the tax laws that we passed and enforced. All of those have to be brought to bear on these individuals so that we start expecting them to be true economic players, not just trying to dethrone them through criminal investigations.
Matthew, you got a minute. I'm sorry
Okay.
for time management.
First, let me say I do agree with respect to Ukraine completely with Daria's point that the focus of all future reforms needs to be on institution building. And it also needs to be on, dismantling those structures in existing institutions where oligarchy is embedded. And so that, that the focus, yes, of course, there are individual oligarchs, and yes, of course, many of them should be in jail. And that should happen in the natural course of events. But the real heart of the reform challenge is to build the new institutions that will reward an entrepreneurial economy. On the larger question of how this fits with both the United States and, let's say, global economics, it does need to be said that globalization, as it has taken place over the last 3 decades, has both been fueled corruption and is now being fueled by oligarchic corruption. And so as the Biden administration turns towards the future, and it's very important to note that President Biden has said to all of his cabinet, please come up with a better solution set. I think we can look towards the possibility that a new vision of global economics will come out of this. Let's call it globalization 2.0, in which it is going to be based on the rule of law.
Daria, do you want to talk?
I will have more opportunities to talk, so I thank you for this panel.
Yes,
Let's
thank you,
do
everybody.
things with talk. It's a good conversation, we'll continue, but I also hope that there will be some actions as a follow-up actions to what we have discussed today.
All right. Thank you all. Great discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.